Trails and Ghost Towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts, and with me, loaded for bear, is Bill Barlee, because today we've got a story that'll just raise the hair on the back of your neck. What's the shotgun?
Well, Mike, that plays a part in the story.
Yeah.
That plays one of the minor roles in the story.
Okay, in addition to that, a triangle. It looks like the thing you called to breakfast for.
That's right.
And the gold nugget.
All three play minor roles in what I consider one of the greatest treasure stories ever to come out of the Old West. And not only that, I think it still exists. Now that's unusual, because out of every 100 treasure stories I research, about 93 are fictitious. This one, I've slowly changed my mind over 20 years, Mike. I wasn't sure. I thought there was a 50-50 chance. But after perusing the information and examining all bits and parts of the puzzle that makes up this story, I think this particular treasure still exists.
Well, stop the suspense, and where are we going today? Where's this treasure story?
The treasure is sometimes called the Lost Mine of Pitt Lake. I don't like to call it that. I'd rather call it Schlumac's Lost Mine.
Schlumac's Lost Mine.
Yep.
Okay, when we come back, Schlumac's Lost Mine and some characters we've mentioned in history before reappear, and just a great mystery. Don't go away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Bill Barlee with us today, of course, as always, talking about Schlumac's Lost Mine. Where does this rank in the Lost Mine game?
Well, I think it ranks up there with Jacob Waltz's Lost Dutchman Mine of Arizona. And I think it's better because I think this one exists. I think the Lost Dutchman was found and was mined out. This one has not been found. I think it's there. And you know, this is a story that has all the elements, Mike. It has murder, it has a hanging, it has a disappearance, and it has a lost mine. And really, what we're concentrating on is three individuals. We're certainly going to concentrate on an Indian shaman who's a guy called Schumac, John Schumac. Then we go to a mysterious and kind of a shadowy American, a guy called Jackson. And finally we end up with Volcanic Brown, one of the most singular prospectors in all of British Columbia. And I think we should go at one by one through the time periods. Okay. Time is 1880s. New Westminster is well established. And here's a photograph of Columbia Avenue in New Westminster as it looks around the 1880s, when at this particular juncture in history.
This looks more like a city should look.
Well, sure. And down the street comes an Indian shaman, and he comes into New Westminster and he plunks on the bar approximately $1,400 to $1,800 in nugget gold. Unusual even for the 1880s. Very coarse gold, and that's about 100 ounces at that particular time. It makes quite a stir. But he disappears. He appears again the next year. This is 1887, 1888. Another approximately 100 ounces, between $1,400 and $1,800. And again the third year, another 100 ounces. Now people are starting to talk about him. They call him, his name is Schumac, and John Schumac, he comes from the Silver Creek Reserve, and he's fairly well known there. And they start to relate disappearances of individuals. They say he's taken people into this lost mine, and they help them recover the gold, then he kills them to prevent the story from leaking out. There's no proof of this at all, Mike. Absolutely no proof at all. But in 1890, he hits the scene again. And what happens is he gets in an argument with a half-breed called Louis B. And Louis B. Insults the old man. The old man shoots him, and he kills him. Then he disappears into that fastness of the Pitt Lake country. And Mike, when I'm talking about the Pitt Lake country, this is some of the most difficult terrain on the Pacific slope. There's no doubt about it. There are creeks coming every which way. The mountains are precipitous. It's extremely difficult country to travel. So he disappears for several weeks. Finally, two Indian constables pick him up, and the Indian agent, a guy called McTiernan. They bring him back to New Westminster. This is 1890, the fall of 1890. He's arraigned in trial before Chief Justice Montague Tyrrell Drake, who, actually the Drake family is still in British Columbia. Many of them in the legal profession, by the way. And He addresses the jury, and the jury takes 15 minutes to find him guilty.
This
Great.
is summary justice. Is this summary justice, or are you going to?
No, they had him.
Yeah.
They really did have
Yeah.
him. He had killed B, he admitted it, and said it was the only crime he'd ever committed and so on. And anyway, he is pronounced to be hung at the nearest, hanged, I should say, to be correct, at the nearest opportunity. And interesting, because on the 16th of January in 1891, he goes to the jail yard in New Westminster, and he is hanged. And the New Westminster Columbia, the old paper which covered New Westminster for almost 100 years, says this, and it's rather interesting, Mike. Paid the penalty. Old Schumac was hanged in the yard of the provincial jail this morning at 8 o'clock for the murder on September 8th last of Louis B. To Mr. McTiernan, Indian agent, Schumac made a statement in which he said the murder of Louis B. was the only crime he had ever committed, although he was credited with more. Now that's interesting because he alludes to that. And the Indians said, he said this in Chinook, Nika memloose, mine memloose, which in Chinook means, when I die, the mine dies. Now there's no record of that in the official records, the court records, or Turret Drake's bench notes at all. But that was in Chinook, so indeed it could have taken place. So what happens immediately after the death of Schumac is this rumor, this story about the lost mine doesn't die. So for several years, a number of individuals go up into that Pit Lake region and they look for it. But the one individual, and again, a shadowy guy, a guy named Jackson, he appears on the scene in New Westminster about 1901, Mike. And he comes in, he's a very taciturn man. He's a prospector, he comes from California and probably from San Francisco. He sits in the saloons, he draws a lot of the old-timers into conversation, he listens very carefully. He has big ears and he has a tight mouth, okay?
Uh-huh.
And he listens carefully for a number of days. Then he goes and obtains all the current maps of this area. This is 1901, so there's some fairly good maps. And he disappears, taking a horse with him, he disappears into the fastnesses somewhere between Pit Lake and Stave Lake. We're not sure which. He reappears on the scene again, Mike, about 3 months later. He's a changed man. He's emaciated, he's sick, he's barely able to make it back into New Westminster. But with him, he is carrying a very heavy pack, which he guards literally around the clock. He stays in New Westminster a very short time, 2 or 3 days. Then he disappears, heading south as fast as he can go. And the word then drifts back from San Francisco that he went into the Bank of British North America, and there he cashed gold, which was around $10,000. Actually, the locals did exaggerate slightly, Mike.
To what extent?
Well, I
mean,
think...
is there only $5,000 in gold, or is there... what's your assessment of that?
Well, my assessment is that it's cleared up in a later letter, which we allude to as the story goes on.
Okay. So Jackson obviously came away with some gold that he obtained in the Pit Lake area. So you think he's a credible historic character?
I think he is, because of the letter that originally turns up.
Okay.
Now, the third character to come into this scene now is Jackson, we assume, is back in San Francisco. And the story goes that he wrote a letter which explained where he was at, and that was accompanied by a map. Now, only part of that's true. And sitting in Grand Forks is a guy called Volcanic Brown.
We've heard of Volcanic Brown before.
Yeah, sure. Volcanic Brown is one of the great characters of the Pacific Slope. There's no doubt about it. He was called Sunset Brown, and he was called Gold Tooth Brown, and $1 Million Brown, and North Fork Brown, and all sorts of names. But the name he reveled in was Volcanic Brown. So most people knew him as Volcanic Brown, and he wrote in very large letters, Mike, and he called himself on his letterhead, and he had a letterhead, the greatest prospector in the world.
This guy was,
he was
an ego to suit the time.
Sure he was. And he was a good prospector, there's no doubt about it, because that triangle we were looking at, that one right there, Mike, that comes from Copper Mountain. And this is part of the story of Volcanic Brown.
Is this the Copper Mountain near Princeton?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's to this day producing copper and gold ore.
Yeah, one of the great mines of British Columbia. So he went in there in the late 1880s, and by 1890, he gets some information from a guy called Jameson. He goes up into this area, and Jameson was a half-blood in the area who discovered some float ore. Volcanic Brown goes up there along with another guy called Emil Voigt, and he stakes a whole group of claims, which he calls the Sunset Claims. That's why they call him Sunset Brown as well.
Yeah.
So And these claims are so rich that he puts down a shaft and he hits it right on the nose. Now, Copper Mountain has been operating intermittently almost for 100 years. But this mine had some very, very spectacular ground, and who hits it right on the nose with the very first shaft? Volcanic Brown.
He's now got the reputation that'll carry him right across the province.
Not only that, he has the reputation, he has the monies. Because somewhere along the line, they give him between $40,000 and $45,000, which is a lot of money in the late 1890s. Mm-hmm. And he then settles down to become a bit of a man of leisure for a while. First thing he does, his teeth are shot. So he buys himself a solid set of gold teeth. And I think I mentioned
hence Gold Tooth Brown.
That's right, Gold Tooth Brown. He buys himself a set of solid gold teeth, and you can see him smiling half a mile away on a sunny day. And indeed you could. And not only that, he buys himself a new rigs, matched black horses, and a wagon to match. And he then settles down, he comes down from the North Fork, because what had happened in the North Fork, Mike, is interesting too. He had a checkered career, and he was a small man, but he was a guy who didn't back away from people.
Could this perhaps have been associated with his volcanic personality, or did that come from something else?
No, that came from Volcanic Mountain.
Oh, okay,
so it wasn't really that. And what happened on the North Fork was stayed with him the rest of his life, and there he killed a man. And what happened was a guy was called Kentucky Brown, and Kentucky Brown was married to a woman who had his stepson, and he didn't like his stepson, and he abused the stepson. And so the stepson, his stepfather was in a drunken rage. He fled to Volcanic Brown's cabin. Volcanic Brown let him in. And the father came beating with an axe on the door. And Brown says, if you come through that door, I'll kill you. The guy came right through the door with the axe. Volcanic Brown took one shot and killed him. The jury in Grand Forks were very sympathetic. They found him not guilty due to justifiable homicide. And indeed, that was the case. So anyway, as the years pass, Volcanic Brown's $40,000 starts to diminish, naturally, as most prospectors are inclined to do. And he hears about the story, and he hears about Jackson, and he hears about Schumac, and he hears about the existence of a letter. He spends about a decade looking for the letter, and finally it falls into his hands. And the letter is really quite fascinating, because here's the letter.
Now you have an actual copy of this letter.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
And you don't have the original, but you know who has it.
That's right, I do. And what happened was, the letter was written by Jackson, and the letter is to a guy called Hill. Now, some people say it's Shotwell. I don't think it is. Hill.
It's Shotwell?
Yeah, some people say it's Shotwell, a guy named Shotwell.
Okay.
I think it's a man named Hill.
All right.
And evidently Hill had grub-staked Jackson in leaner times. Jackson goes back to San Francisco, realizes he will never get back to the lost mine. He decides to repay this debt of honor to his old grub-staker. He writes him a letter, and this letter falls into Volcanic Brown's hands.
The contents of that letter and other hair-raising details when we come back after this break. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee, and in Bill's right hand, a reproduced letter Jackson sent to Hill. This is a remarkable piece of work.
And it's authentic, Mike, and I'll tell you why it's authentic. Volcanic Brown gets this letter in 1923. He finally goes to the government agent in Grand Forks, and he gives them a copy of the letter, deleting 2 words only. The government stamp, government agent being a good civil servant, he takes a date stamp and dates it. Bang. And the date is May the 28th, 1924. So we know this letter is authentic. We know it's almost 70 years old, and this is the letter. And this is a very fascinating letter.
Jackson is in San Francisco and has written this to his old grubstaker Hill, wanting Hill to benefit.
Jackson is probably dying, and he says this to Hill. I had been out over 2 months and found myself running short of grub. I had lived mostly on fresh meat, for one can't carry much of a pack in those hills. I found a few very promising ledges and colors in the little creeks, but nothing I cared to stay with. I'd almost made up my mind to light out the next day. I climbed up to the top of a sharp ridge and looked down into the canyon or valley about 1.5 miles long. And what struck me as singular, it appeared to have no outlet for the little creek that flowed at the bottom. Afterwards, I found that the creek entered a blank and was lost. I think that is Box Canyon and was lost. After some difficulty, I made my way down to the creek. The water was almost white, so it obviously came from a glacier, Mike. The formation for the most part had been slate and granite, but there I found a kind of schist and slate formation. Now comes the interesting part. I'd only a small prospecting pan, but I found colors at once right on the surface, and such colors they were. I knew then that I'd struck it right at last. In going upstream, I came to a place where the bedrock was bare, and there, you could hardly believe me, the bedrock was yellow with gold. Some of the nuggets was as big as walnuts, and there were many chunks carrying quartz, which means it was close to the source, Mike. After sizing it up, I saw there was millions stowed around in the little cracks. Then he mines the ground, okay, and then he goes on to say, on account of the weight, I buried part of the gold at the foot of a large, tent-shaped rock facing the creek. You can't miss it. There is a mark cut out in it, taking with me what I supposed to be $10,000 in gold, but afterwards it proved to be a little over $8,000. Now this is very interesting, Mike, and I want to hesitate here for a moment. He took out what he thought was about 45 troy pounds of gold, but he was tired, he was sick, he was literally staggering. So he only took out about 39 to 40 pounds.
What was making these people sick and awful? Is it just the sheer agony of this terrain? Is this...
Mike, this is Devil's Club, this is quicksand, this is precipitous mountains. It's some of the toughest country in the world to walk through. I've been in that country. It's very, very tough indeed. So anyway, he says afterwards it proved to be a little over $8,000. So that means somewhere along the line he cashed that gold in, probably at the Bank of British North America in San Francisco. And then he goes on to say, after 3 days hard traveling, it would not have been over 2 days good going, but the way was rough and I was not feeling well. I arrived at the lake, and while resting there was taken sick, and have never since been able to return. And now I fear I never shall. I am alone in the world, no relatives, and no one to look after me for anything. Of course, I have never spoken of this find during all this time for fear of it being discovered. It has caused me many anxious hours, but the place is so well guarded by surrounding ridges and mountains that it should not be found for many years, unless someone knew of it being there. Oh, how I wish I could go with you and show you this wonderful place, for I cannot give you any exact directions, and it may take a year or more to find. Don't give up, but keep at it, and you will be repaid beyond your wildest dreams. I believe any further directions would only tend to confuse it, so I'll only suggest further that you go alone, or at least take only 1 or 2 trusty Indians to pack food, and no one need know but that you are going on a hunting trip until you find the place, and get everything for yourself. When you find it, and I am sure you will, should you care to see me, advertise in the Frisco Examiner. That is the San Francisco Examiner. Mm-hmm. And if I am living, I will either come to see you or let you know where to find me. But once more I say to you, don't fail to look this great property up, and don't give up until you find it. Now goodbye, and may success attend you. Yours truly, W. Jackson.
He wrote that to Hill when?
Probably in 1904. And the interesting thing, Mike, when I first examined this letter a little over 20 years ago, and this is verbatim, exactly it was written, with the exception of those 2 deleted terms, which Volcanic Brown deleted because he didn't want the Indian, at least the government agent, to see it. And the interesting thing is, he uses mining terms, placer mining terms, such as schist, such as bedrock, and he uses American terms, light out, O, with just the O rather than OH, as we say, and chunks, and so on. So, and then he refers to the San Francisco Examiner, and I think one of the keys to this whole letter is when he says he packed out what he thought was $10,000 worth of gold, and he said it was only $8,000 worth of gold. Now, if this were a counterfeit letter, a spurious thing, mm-hmm. then he would say, I packed out $10,000 worth of gold and leave it at that. But he didn't, you see. Yeah. And so he refers back to he didn't quite make it.
Now, and this went to Hill in 1901. Did Hill ever try to do it in 1904? Did Hill ever try to find it himself?
Evidently, Hill did. And he gave up on it and turned the map over to another individual who was not known. We don't know who actually picked this letter up for Volcanic Brown. We do know that Volcanic Brown confided to several people in Grand Forks that the 2 missing words were Box Canyon. So that creek went down into a box canyon and disappeared. Now this is 1923. He starts out in 1924. And he goes down by the long route, leading a horse, goes into that country, and first he goes up Pitt Lake. And Volcanic Brown covers the head of Pitt Lake all through 1924, Mike, all through, and again in the summer of 1925, again in the summer of 1926, and again in the summer of 1927. Finally, he decides he doesn't like the formation he sees at the head of Pitt Lake, and he's gone over it very, very well. This is a fine prospector. He's well into his 70s by then. He's approaching 80 years old, but he's still out to get the $1 million mine. But in 1928, he changes. He goes up the Stave River, and he goes up the Stave, and he heads towards the headwaters. He does that same in 29 and 1930. And he goes in there in 1930, and he's supposed to come out in September. He doesn't come out in September. His friends are worried. They send on word to the coast. He hasn't come back. So they wait until, actually they wait till the end of October. And then they send out 4 individuals. And the 4 individuals consist of a policeman, and his name is Eugene Murphy. He's a provincial policeman, and a guy called George Stevenson, and a guy called Bill McMaster, and his brother Roy McMaster. Stevenson's a game warden, the other 2 are part trappers. They go up there, and they begin looking for, at the head of Stave Lake, they begin looking for Volcanic Brown. 2 of them, one of them is hurt. Murphy is hurt. He is taken back by Bill McMaster. That leaves only 2 of them, Stevenson and Roy McMaster, to carry on the search. They go through that country in terrific, horrendous conditions for 27 days. They're ready to give up on the last and final day. They come across a camp near the headwaters of the Stave River. Tent is collapsed. The camp is abandoned. The fire is not warm. And they look at the camp and they realize it's Volcanic Brown's camp. There's no sign of Volcanic Brown. There's no sign of his pony, which actually belonged to my grandfather Richie. He'd bought it from him in Cascade City. And there's no sign of the prospecting equipment. His pan is gone, his pick is gone, his shovel is gone. But there are some things there. There's a shotgun. There's some cooking utensils. There's this type of shotgun, almost exactly. Yeah. And there's some cooking utensils. And there's a notebook with some herbal remedies. They look under the tent and they find a little bottle. It's filled with 11 ounces of coarse-edged gold. But it isn't placer gold, it's hard rock gold.
So is that the last evidence of this mine?
It's the last evidence. It proves to me that Volcanic Brown was probably in the right area. He may have found a seam of gold, which was hard rock, and he chips it out. Then he goes looking in the area for a creek that carries the gold. And then he disappears. He vanishes off the face of the earth.
Never to be seen again?
Never to be seen again.
And any other findings in this area?
Nothing at all. 11 individuals in the last 60 or 70 years have disappeared and have died actually in the attempt. Some of them have been wild finance trips, some of them have been solo efforts, and they've died looking for the lost mine of Schumac.
Now you've flown over this area, walked this area.
Yeah.
What's your sense?
My sense is that it's probably between Stave Lake and Harrison Lake and to the north of both of those lakes. I think it's in that area. Very difficult area. I agree with Volcanic Brown. It isn't on Pitt Lake. It's at the head of Stave or between Stave and Harrison.
And there's a creek that runs milky because it comes from a glacier.
Yep.
You have to go past granite and slate. You have to get to...
where there's some schist.
Some schist, and then... All right, that's all the time we have for today's Gold Trails. We'll be back next time. Join me then.